to this video. Today I am going to be analyzing this John Wick animation that I did. So it opens up with this guy hitting the glass, and this glass is this whole thing that's around here. This is a static bake to paint, and pretty much how I did it was it's a cube that has been squished, and then I used the cutout tool, and I just broke it up like this with the cutout tool, and then I deleted whatever it is in the middle, and then I just converted the perimeter with using bake to paint and gave it some transparency settings with some shininess. These pieces that are falling, this is all driven by movable objects, and it's also action recorded. So all of the physics are recorded with the action recorder. But what I'm looking at are the compositional lines that kind of go down this way, and also just trying to use this other character to draw, you know, our attention to John Wick. So all of the compositional lines, you know, it's all being drawn to John. I'm using the same thing here. So his eye line and his arm is leading us to look at the knife that he's grabbing. And for this shot, I just animated the top half of the characters. I didn't animate their feet because it's not in the shot. The thing that was most difficult to animate was his feet. So each time it kind of lifts off the ground or touches, what you do when animating feet is you look at the heel and you look at the toe, and then basically the step is like when it's flat on the ground, that's one keyframe, but then when it starts to lift off a heel, that's another keyframe. And then there's also an up pose when it's off the ground. So this is the ground here. So once it lifts off the ground and reached the arc of the motion, that's another keyframe. So that's the in-between. And then the same thing with toes, like when the toe touches, that's also a keyframe. So each time it makes contact, leaves contact, the last point of contact, the arc of the motion, you know, those are all individual keyframes. So when you're animating feet, you want to look for the first point of contact, last point of contact, whether it's the heel or the toe, and then you're looking for the arc. So say his feet lift here and then touches here, there is a point where it indicates how the arc is going to move. There is a bit of a kind of shaky motion in John Wick's hand. That's really easy to do. All I'm doing with that is with an action recorder, I'm capturing the motion of the gyroscope in the controller. So all I needed to do was kind of shake my hand around a bit as well. So instead of keyframing things on the timeline, like to get the shakes, you just use an action recorder and then kind of shake the controller around, and that gives the kind of like tension in the hand a little bit. Now here, you know, it's also like you also want to keep an eye out with the composition. Like there's the orange kind of color kind of glowing here. So our focus is meant to be on this guy, but I spent a long time animating these two, so I just wanted the focus to be on those two as well. And as soon as they make contact as well, like these are two separate rigs, but as soon as they make contact, their timing becomes the same. That's when you want to treat it like it's a dog, like a four-legged animal or something. So now you have to worry about 4 feet and then the kind of spine that they're connected with, but in this case the spine is like their hands connecting with each other. And that's an easy way to kind of think about like the overall motion, because as soon as two people kind of connect, the kind of center of gravity changes. So then two characters who have separate centers of gravity like this, as soon as you make contact with each other, the center of gravity like goes in the middle. So then the pivot point, that center of gravity like goes at the point of contact. So then you pretty much are like animating like a four-legged animal. So that's how like I think about it when animating two characters interacting with each other. One of the most difficult things to do is contact with the ground. So anything where a character makes contact with the ground, even this character at the back here, this is when you're dealing with IK, like inverse kinematics. And inverse kinematics keeps the hands like flat on the ground and it doesn't pass through the ground. And this guy doing this crazy flip was very challenging to do, and in order to get, John to lie flat on the ground, you have to disable all of the physics, all of the things like movable, disable collidable, disable auto look, and all of those procedural animations like auto walk, auto jump. This is a real-time engine that you're working with, and it's also a game engine. So it comes with like procedural animations that you have to kind of disable when you're animating something very specific. His 2 feet, they're IK, his hand is IK, and then as soon as they lift, to get this arc like this, when he throws stuff, I try to keep this nice arc kind of flowing. This is what you want to keep your eye out for with any kind of motion, because when you're keyframing with IK, it will kind of go in a zigzaggy kind of motion. Like if you have a keyframe like this, it'll interpolate it like this. But if you convert it to an FK, it's driven by the pivot points from the joints, so then you get the nice kind of arc. Same thing with like the character in the back, you want that kind of arc when they're going down and stuff. And again, the guy in the middle, he's doing this crazy flip, which is difficult because he's on all fours. You're dealing with IK again, so this is all IK animation, just to avoid his hands and feet and all of that clipping through. And the glass, again, is using bake to paint for the perimeter, and then these action recorded kind of physical glass. So I'm trying to keep the arc of the motion here. And that's pretty much all achieved with FK. So this scene is pretty difficult because there's 3 characters trying to kill each other. So the first interaction is John throwing the knife and hitting this guy on the shoulder. So we get that little bit of interaction. Second one, we have the knife hitting this guy here, and it's like bouncing off. And he's reacting to it as well. And then, he throws the knife, it hits John. So John needs to kind of react to it. And meanwhile, while these two are throwing knives at each other and they're kind of reacting to each other, this guy on the left, he's running up and he's going to interact with this glass. So there's a lot of staging involved. So I needed to work out the distance, like between where he's standing here to when he actually goes up to that glass plane, and it kind of breaks before he punches it. And the reason why is because it takes us time to register what's happening. Keeping track of all of the knives was also another difficult thing, because you can see here in this shot, he's pulling the knife out and then kind of dropping it. So you can kind of see him drop it here. So he's pulling it out, he throws it, and then it drops to the floor. He's going up, he's picking a knife off of the counter, and then smashing the glass for some reason, probably to get another knife. And throughout this, like, we're focused on these two. Like, this guy is about to, like, try and stab John. But then in the back, blurred out, that's also something that I had to animate. So anything in the background is something, like, you have to animate as well. The reason why you do is to try and keep the scene alive. And John is pulling the knife out, and the way I do that is like, it's already constrained to his top arm, so then it's kind of like rigged in a way so that when he pulls it out a certain distance, like, it'll turn off the constraint, and then it's also constrained to his hand. So there's a lot of technical kind of rigging involved and keyframing involved in order to get that, in order to get him to pull out the knife like that. And that stuff is pretty difficult to do. This scene was the most difficult to animate in the whole thing because, once again, they're one rig. So you're animating a four-legged animal, his head is interacting with the environment, so there's glass breaking. And to increase the difficulty as well, this guy, he's throwing knives into his back, and then he has to react to this guy. So he is pretty much a ragdoll to John. He's being used as a shield. So the kind of main drive is from John, kind of like pushing him. So he's reacting to John, and then he's also reacting to this guy, and then he's also reacting to the glass and the environment. So this was insane to animate because, like, the feet, like, once again, so each time the foot, like, lifts, each time the foot is flat, each time it lifts, there's arcs. So the foot has an arc going up. There's last points and first points of contact. There's a lot of shimmying happening. So sometimes, the foot is flat on the ground, but then it shimmies like this a little bit. So then that's also a keyframe. So it's still flat, but it's actually sliding across the floor. and pivoting from the heel and stuff like that. So all of the footwork here was kind of crazy. And each time it lifts, each time it makes contact, it's all keyframed. And it was absolutely difficult to do because it's just animating like a four-legged animal. So then, it's a four-legged animal here, and then once he's on the ground, it splits into two. So once they're not making contacts anymore, that's when they're off on their own kind of timing. So they're separate. So the timing of both of them is separate once they break apart. But then, when they're together like this, these points of contact, they're moving at the same rate. They're moving at the same time. So you gotta be aware of like the curves that you're doing, because if you have the curve moving at a different rate to John, it's gonna look like they're separate, and it's gonna move at a different rate and slide at a different rate. So the kind of curve for both of them has to be in sync, and the timing has to be in sync because they're making contact with each other. But as soon as they separate, that's when the curves can be separate. So then, this one can go up like this, and then this one can be a bit more flat or do something like this. That's when they separate. And again, like, the knives are constrained to John. So constrained to the hand here, and then there's an in-between knife that leaves the hand and then goes to the next constraint, which is on the side of this character here. So it kind of hits him on the side, and now it's constrained to like this piece. So there's one group. So you have to group it and then turn on and off the visibility of these things. This shot was very difficult because now, like, John is interacting with the ground, and that means a lot of IK and FK work just to get the kind of pose right, and to get his hand not to clip through the ground was very difficult to do. And then he goes up. The pivot point here is at his elbow. So to try and keep the elbow in one spot and have him kind of pivot from the elbow without it clipping through so much, this other hand go flat like this, have his knee not clip through, have all of these things do what I want it to do. So now he's like shifting his knee up, and also like keep in mind, like, these puppets are not in proportion to the actors. So that was another challenge. So this is all IK. And then the knees, how do you keep the knees from staying in one spot without it clipping through the ground? And you can kind of see it clip through there. Like, it's not perfect, but that's as close as I could get it. Now, this one, John is holding 5 knives, and it's all constrained to his hands. And this guy also has, a lot of knives going into him. So these are all constrained to his body. So it's pretty much turning on and off the visibility on both of the characters. So I'm turning off the visibility of the constraints when he's throwing the knives, and then once it like reaches the other guy, I'm turning on the visibility on the other guy. And when it's grouped in the puppet, you have to be very careful with visibility, because it's very easy to just turn off the entire head, for example. And his tie here, that's all physics based, but sometimes, the physics doesn't really work and it's clipping through his body. I'm pretty much keyframing the tie to like kind of stick out more, just to influence how the physics of the tie is kind of moving when he's throwing it, so nothing is clipping through each other. And here, this one, if you look closely at his hands, there's 2 in this hand, there's 1 in this hand, and what he's doing is grabbing the blades from his left hand. So now there's 1 in this hand, there's 1 in this hand. He grabs the blade again, so now there's 1 in this hand, and now there's 0 in this hand. Yeah, the feet as well, each time it makes contact, or the last point of contact here is in a particular pose. That's a keyframe. Lift, contact, hold the pose, shimmy, lift, last point of contact, up pose, contact, lift, contact, lift, contact. I wish it was that simple where you can have it procedurally animated, but each time he's doing that little shuffle with the feet there, that's all animated like by hand. Something that I kind of made a mistake with was making the set way too wide. So the set in this animation is actually wider than the one that's in the movie. There's a lot of improvisation that you have to do because the characters, they're also not in the same proportion as the actors. So here's the wall here, like this cupboard here that he interacts with. In the original, is actually much closer to him. So since I made the set way more wide, I had to think of the spacing and try to make his movement feel realistic, because he needs to like hit certain things at a certain time, and stuff like that is challenging as well as like improvising and stitching those kind of errors that I made when creating the set, because now he has to move back a little bit further just to get the Foley right, because this is all animated to sound. So there needs to be that sound when it hits the cupboard. And the cupboard, the problem is like much more wider than in the reference. So there's a lot of improvisation that I had to do. Sometimes you have to exaggerate it just to get the timing with the audio in sync. Sometimes you gotta tweak like the spacing and the staging of things just to make the scene work. And I think that was challenging. Overall, like, I'm really happy with how this turned out, but there was a lot of technical stuff behind it, like heaps of stuff that I had to do to kind of make it work.
Yeah!